Hello, everybody. Nice to have you back. This is Analytical Sociology, now in a different format. You see me here in the comfort of my home. But before we get started with the lecture, let me sort out a few practical details with you. Hang on a moment, I heard something.
Oh, hello.
Who are you?
I didn't know that somebody was here already.
But hang on, this is my lecture.
No, I don't know what you were told, but I've been told to give this lecture online. Our president, Andrew Deeks, he said now we're moving to distance learning, and this is sort of what I'm going to do.
No, I don't care what Andrew Deek said. This is my lecture and this is how I'm going to do it.
I don't care what you want to do. This is what I'm going to do. So can you please stop invading my lecture?
Hang on, what are you doing?
No, this is my lecture. This is analytical
No,
sociology, isn't it?
no, don't push me
No, I don't
away.
have time for this nonsense. I think we need to get you out of here.
Preview.
Sorry for that, guys. This dude was really annoying, wasn't he? Well, okay, here we are. So let's get this started. This is the same lecture, Analytical Sociology, School of Sociology, UCD. I'm going to deliver these lectures online. Many things will be the same as before. You will see videos from me. We will have our second take-home test as scheduled. We won't have an exam at the end of the trimester anymore. Instead, we will have an assignment. As soon as I have the details about that, I will let you know. Okay, guys, so enjoy the lecture. Take care. Better take care of that guy.
Okay, after all this nonsense, let's get down to business. Let's continue with the lecture. Today I want to talk to you more about broken window theory. We had already started that before the break, but now I want to go a little further with that and also talk about a study that I conducted in this regard with students last year. So we talked about broken window theory, and after that I want to get into an area of social context in broken window theory, and lastly about how to do that at UCD, which is what we actually did. So broken window theory, just a little reminder, it is this idea that when a window has been broken in already, that then others might be more likely to throw in other windows. That's sort of where the name comes from, and it means when you observe a norm being violated already, you might be less likely to follow that norm yourself. And this could happen in all sorts of contexts. There was the experiment by Zimbardo, where he put the car in the Bronx and another car in Palo Alto, and once he had thrown in the window himself with a sledgehammer, even the car in Palo Alto quickly started to disappear. Broken window theory goes back to Wilson and Kelling. They suggest that signs of disorder like broken windows, litter, and graffiti induce other types of disorder and petty crime. And it was thought that removing these signs of disorder would take away an important trigger of criminal behavior. An area where broken window theory has been applied is in the context of littering. There the idea is that if some people throw something on the floor, then others might think, why should I go to the rubbish bin? Somebody has to pick that piece of rubbish up anyway, so I can as well just throw my piece of rubbish on the floor as well. So that kind of small infringements of that norm of not throwing something on the floor might actually cause others to equally transgress this norm of not throwing something onto the floor. And I talked in the lecture about a study which is pretty much a landmark study by Kaiser and others, published in Science. It's a pretty cool study. They had six different experiments on the spread of disorder. And I talked about 4 different ones, about graffitis, about bikes, shopping carts, mailboxes, and so on. And the core, remember the one about graffiti was where they put graffiti at the wall in an alley in the Netherlands, in Groningen, and they put that graffiti at that wall next to the sign that said no graffiti. Obviously they kind of transgressed that norm, so they broke what they call the context norm. no graffiti, but obviously there was graffiti at the wall. And then they observed how many people threw a flyer onto the floor that was attached to bikes that were parked in that alley. Now that was sort of the treatment condition. And the control condition was where there was just no graffiti at the wall next to the sign, no graffiti. And also in the one case, the context norm was clearly broken. And in the other case, the context norm was not broken. And in both scenarios, they observed how do people adhere to a target norm, which was there was a flyer attached to the bikes. People had to get rid of that flyer. How many of those flyers would be thrown onto the floor? That was sort of the general thing. And the findings were pretty stunning that a lot of people, when the graffiti norm was being broken, was more than twice as many people that threw the flyer onto the floor, compared to the scenario where the no graffiti norm was not broken. And that was just one of those examples. You know, they had other examples who talked about bikes, about people walking through, I don't know, a fence, even though, you know, it was prohibited to do so. Shopping carts was again this idea of flyers onto the floor. And the treatment was like shopping carts standing around in the parking lot of a shopping center, yes or no. And with mailboxes, the treatment was a rubbish bin or bag next to a mailbox where money was sticking out. So these are just some examples. So I think what I would like you to do now is take a moment. We can't do this together, but take a moment and pause the video and think about a design for how we could study the broken window theory on the UCD campus. Could we do something similar to Kaiser et al.? I would be really curious about that. What could we do? Okay, so let me continue. The next thing, I'll come back to the broken window theory on campus in a while. But before, I want to talk about social context and broken window theory. So we talked about the general idea of broken window theory, you know, that how disorder can spread. Now you might wonder, what is the importance of social capital in that context? How does it matter where you do that experiment? Would you get a different result in Dublin 1 than in Dublin 4, for example? And that's exactly what Mark Koschnick and Tobias Wohlbrink looked at. They looked at how social capital matters for the spreading of disorder or for the violation of norms in the line of the broken window thesis. So they conducted two experiments published in Rationality and Society that try to replicate the original Kaiser et al. Study quite a bit, but then they kind of added their own twist to it, which was looking at different areas in town where they knew there was different social capital. So how did they start this? Well, the general thinking is one can think of a rational choice model of crime. In this context, individuals commit crime when the expected benefit outweighs the expected cost. And according to this model, it is rational for individuals to break a rule as long as the chance of punishment is small compared with the potential gains of deviance. So you could think that criminals are rational actors. And that's a reasonable approach. It was popularized by Becker in 1968. Now, it's maybe not always. Sometimes you see people committing crime, you wonder, those guys are not very clever. You know, they didn't really think that through. But generally, it's an interesting theoretical framework to think about not just the behavior of people, but also about the committing of crime. And when you apply this rational choice model on to the spread of disorder, and that's what Koschnick and Wohlbrink do in their paper, that's sort of like the theoretical framing that they apply. You could think that if there is a disorder in a given situation or neighborhood, nobody has prevented norm violations or previously sanctioned them. As when you walk into a dodgy part of town and you see a lot of rubbish lying around, what happens? You realize or you observe that nobody seemed to have punish these violations of people throwing down rubbish in this situation. Yeah? So you generate an idea about how likely it is that a norm gets sanctioned or a norm violation gets sanctions. So basically, when you think, okay, well, it seems to be a safe bet to throw something on the floor here, nobody seems to care. Nobody seems to come after me. Yeah? And you conclude that from observing lots of these infringements to begin with. So the number of previous norm violations committed by others negatively influences the perceived costs of sanctions. Yeah? You could think that the expected costs of an action are different depending on what you observe. But this rational choice model of crime is also limited in its applicability in the case of minor norm violations. And that's a reasonable point. Because the benefits and costs of littering or, for example, jaywalking, that's another thing they look at, are so small that they cannot be seriously interpreted as criminal incentives or inhibitors. It appears to be unrealistic to assume that actors invest in costly search when breaking minor norms. Think about it. So the idea is we think of individuals as being rational actors, right? So I think about, does it make sense to commit a crime? I think about, does it make sense for me to throw something onto the floor? And according to this rational actor model, I would think about my expected gain from that. I would also think about my expected costs from that. And when I observe lots of people who throw something onto the floor, I think the costs are low because everybody seems to be getting away with it. So probably it's a safe thing for me to do too, right? So these kind of changes my perceived costs of committing this act, while the benefit might still be the same. It's like, I'm lazy, I don't have to walk to the rubbish bin, I can just throw it onto the floor. Okay, so here now the criticism of that model of thinking is that, you know, even just thinking about something in a rational way is costly. Yeah? So if I kind of need to stop my brain for a moment and think about the different options that I have and assign them costs and benefits and calculate the score out of that and weigh them against each other, that is costly. Yeah, that takes time itself. And that's one of the big problems that those folks in this area that use a rational choice approach often face. You know, they kind of need to think about, does it make sense for people to take a break and rationally think about it? Because oddly enough, it could be rational to not think about something. It could be rational to just go ahead and do what you always do. And that's sort of the way how this has been solved in the literature. It's like a two-step process. Like individuals, first of all, assess the situation on a low-cost basis and think about, does it make sense for me to make a proper assessment here? It's also called a model of frame selection. And one frame that I could select in that regard is, okay, I should rationally think about it. I should think this through. And then all the costs and benefits calculations get started. Another frame would be just to do what I've always done, yeah, to have a habit, or it's called a schema within this theoretical reasoning. It's a schema that applies that I just go and do that. So instead, individuals resort to easily observable cues for context-specific cues to define or to kind of get an idea which mode of action makes sense. Yeah? So an easily observable cue can tell me whether I should spend a lot of time rationally thinking things through or not. And now when you think about what do neighborhoods do, you know, Dublin 1 or Dublin 4 or other neighborhoods, obviously they differ, right? They differ in terms of social capital that you find. What social capital is, that's a whole other issue. I'm sure you heard about it. I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to leave that very shallow for the moment because there are different kinds of definitions of social capital as well. Let's just assume this is sort of like the combined capital that is there, which is reflected in social status and social class. And a neighborhood highly endowed with social capital should exhibit stronger social control. That's sort of what Koichnik and Wolbrink suggest. And why do they do that? Well, they say if an area is highly endowed with social capital, so you observe, I don't know, a shiny neighborhood. Yeah, you lots of rich people live there. You see fancy cars, you see expensive shops. These are all signs for high social capital in an area. So when you observe that, if an area is highly endowed with social capital, people care more about actions of others, and they are more apt to conform to their behavior. Furthermore, signs of disorder are more salient in areas of high social capital where such disorder is not expected. So when you are in a shiny area in town and you observe some rubbish lying on the floor, it sticks out. But when you go to my neighborhood in Dublin 1 and you observe some rubbish lying in front of the doorstep of the apartment complex where I live, no, it's business as usual. That's sort of what there is. There's actually a lot of rubbish lying around, which I hate, but that's just how it is, right? So that's sort of it's less salient in that area where I am. Quashing and Wolbrink, they say that an interaction effect of disorder, that there should be an interaction effect of disorder and social capital. The effects of physical and social disorder on normals are expected to be stronger in neighborhoods with higher social capital. Basically, they say that this mechanism of spreading of littering, spreading of disorder, that this effect is different in different parts of town, where you have different amounts of social capital. And the reason for that, that's a theoretical argument that they make, the reasoning for that, according to Quashing and Wolbrink, is that in the fancy neighborhood, things are more salient to begin with. And people care more about the actions of others. And they are more apt to conform to these behaviors. So they say in their paper, or they hypothesize that the spreading of disorder should be more pronounced in the neighborhood with high social capital, more pronounced than in a neighborhood with low social capital. So how did they go about that? They tried to replicate the Kaiser et al. Study. So they also looked at people littering and people throwing something onto the floor. And they went about it in the same way. Like taking a flyer and attaching it to bikes. And what they did, they selected dormitories in Munich. And they went to these dormitories. There were bikes parked in front of those dormitories, and they attached flyers to these bikes. But then they didn't go and put graffiti onto the wall. Remember, this is sort of how Kaiser et al. Kind of broke the context. No. Instead, what they did, they put rubbish bags next to those bikes. And so that was the treatment. So in all cases, bikes got those flyers attached to them. But in some cases, there was a rubbish bag next to those bikes. Right? And then the idea was, okay, observing that rubbish, these rubbish bags, does that lead to more breaking of the norm? Keep in mind, those rubbish bags, they were not supposed to be there. So they were lying around there on this area where the bikes were parked, right? So they were sort of like a sign of deterioration. Yeah, nobody seems to care about rubbish lying around here. That's sort of like the idea. That's sort of like the treatment. And then the question is, does seeing these kind of signs, does that lead to people throwing these flyers onto the floor more than when there was no rubbish bag next to the bikes? So that's sort of like the starting lineup, and as you see, this is very similar to the Kaiser et al. Paper. But now something else comes into play, because they had this idea, or they had this question, whether this effect is more or less pronounced in neighborhoods with high or low social capital. So how does the context matter for this whole thing? So they looked at high-class neighborhoods or high-status neighborhoods and low-status neighborhoods in Munich. And, they measured this in different ways. They kind of actually conducted a survey where those students had to fill out sorts of questions. So stuff related to their dorm, whether, I don't know, have to say if they have personal problems, I can consult people in my dorm, or if I feel related to my dorm, if I move out, I will stay in contact with people from my dorm. These are all sort of measures for getting an idea about how related are people to this dorm. What is the cohesion that is there? But then also other sorts of questions about, I don't know, frequency of shared activity. How many times do they cook together? How many times do they eat together, or do sports, or party together, or I don't know, lend a movie in this dorm, and other things. About the depth of contact or perceived cohesion. Also, where students basically answer the question about what they think, how much students would help each other in the dorm where they are living. So these are all sort of questions. That's like a survey that was administered to, or that was given to the folks that lived in this dormitory, and students filled that out. And then based on that, you can generate a measure for social capital. And that's sort of what they've done in this study. And you can read more about that, about how that has been done here and how that has been checked and so on. But at the end of the day, that allows you to give a measure for how much capital, how much social capital is there in one dormitory compared to another dormitory. Okay, so we have these two scenarios where we have then some dormitories, I think at the end they went to 9 in Munich, some were classified as low social capital and others were classified as high social capital. And then in both of these scenarios, they went out and kind of attached flyers to bikes and were counting the number of flyers that people throw onto the ground. But then after that, they placed rubbish sacks on this parking lot next to those bikes. And then they counted the flyers that people throw onto the floor again. So this is a slightly different design. This is sort of like you measure it twice. You measure it first, how many flyers do people throw onto the floor. Then you administer the treatment, which is placing the rubbish sacks onto the parking lot. And then you measure it again, how many people throw the flyers onto the floor when you have the treatment. And now it's sort of like this additional dimension to it, and thinking about whether this effect is more or less pronounced in low or in high social capital dormitories. And you can compare the differences between the low and the high social capital dormitory at the first measurement, before you place this rubbish sacks onto the parking lot, and afterwards as well. Right? So you have two differences that you measure, and then you measure a difference in difference. But it comes clear in a second about how that goes. So now what you see here is you see a graph, you see low social capital and high social capital. These are the different dormitories. On the left-hand side, these are the dormitories that were classified as low social capital. On the right-hand side are the dormitories that were classified as high social capital. And for both cases, now you see control and treatment. Control was how many people throw a flyer onto the floor, right? And treatment was how many people throw a flyer onto the floor after the experimenter has placed a rubbish sack onto that parking lot where it should not have been. So first of all, what you see here is just compare the white bars. So you compare the low social capital white bar with the high social capital white bar. You do observe that in the low social capital dormitory, almost twice as many people throw the flyer that was attached to the bike to the floor. Now that's the first observation that we see. The second observation that we see, and now let's focus on the low social capital graph for the moment. You see that after placing a rubbish sack onto that parking lot, there are more people that throw a flyer onto the floor. And before it was around 46% of the people that threw the flyer onto the floor. And after the experimenters put this rubbish sack onto this parking lot, it was over 60% of people that threw the flyer onto the floor. So clearly putting that rubbish sack there did something. It kind of sent out a signal that it seems to be fine to have rubbish lying around here. Now that's sort of the broken window theory. And that's sort of the first part. That's sort of like the replication part of this study. And you see the same effect in the high social capital neighborhoods. So when things seem to be in order, around 24% of the students threw the flyer onto the floor. But when there was the rubbish sack lying around on that parking lot, that number more than doubled. There was 48% of the people that threw the flyer onto the floor. So in both cases, in both cases, having that queue of rubbish lying around leads to more littering. That's what you can say from this graph. But now the key thing is, and this is sort of where the contribution of this paper is when you look at the difference between control and treatment in the low social capital context and compare that with the difference between control and treatment in the high social capital context. And what we see here is in both settings, like adding that rubbish sack there leads to more littering, but that effect seems to be more pronounced in the high social capital context. So there it goes up from 23.68 up to 48, which is more than doubling. While in the low social capital context, it goes up from 46% to 61%. That's not a doubling. That's sort of like adding 30%. So the effect of placing that rubbish sack there changes the situation more in the high social capital context than in the low social capital context. Although generally in the low social capital context, there's absolutely still more people that throw the flyer onto the floor. So that was sort of like the first contribution that they had to look at how does social capital matter here. They've done a second experiment on jaywalking, and let me briefly talk about that. And that's sort of a study that I would have loved to replicate in Ireland, but it's just not possible because people jaywalk already all the time anyway. So it's one of those odd things where we have a norm that nobody seems to adhere to, or not many people seem to adhere to, and I observed that a lot. I often kind of went to the traffic light and checked people jaywalking just because I'm a social scientist and I kind of am very interested in these kind of things. But in Germany, actually there is a norm that you stop at the traffic lights when it's red and there's no car driving by. In the middle of the night, I'm sure you've all been there in the weekend, in the middle of the night, you're drunk, you're walking home, there's no car on the streets, there's a red traffic light, Germans stop. They don't jaywalk, they don't do that. Same thing in Switzerland where other folks have done similar studies as well. So the norm is jaywalking. And that's sort of what we ultimately look at, what is being broken or not. The treatment in this study, questioning at Warren, they also use the rubbish sacks as the treatment. So what they do, they go to a pedestrian crossing. Here you actually see the picture. On the left-hand side, this is a pedestrian crossing. This is in Munich somewhere. And it's a red traffic light. So they kind of observed, they were sitting nearby at a coffee place, observing how many people walk over this red traffic light when they should actually stop. And then they replicated the whole thing in the second scenario where they put this rubbish sack next to the traffic light. You see now on the right-hand side, we have the same picture, but now you have this rubbish sack just seemingly being abandoned there next to that traffic light. And now they did exactly the same thing again, looking at how many people approach the traffic light and walk over that traffic light from that side of the rubbish bag. You think this is actually a pretty crazy and pretty simple design, where we then can see whether this rubbish sack actually has an impact on people stopping at the traffic light or not. So this is sort of like the design. So there's a lot going on. So what is going on here? So we have, again, what they do. They kind of find, and don't ask me how many locations they have to look at, but they kind of found different neighborhoods in Munich where you have such pedestrian crossings, and they classified these neighborhoods again according to social capital measures. I think in this case they just used existing data on the composition of a neighborhood. We know where, I don't know, what's the average salary in a neighborhood, for example. That's another way to operationalize that. But I'm not entirely sure how they've done it, but something like that. So they classified these pedestrian crossings again, some into low social capital pedestrian crossings and others in high social capital pedestrian crossings. Or better, in pedestrian crossings that were situated in areas where people with high social capital live or where people with low social capital live. So at the top we have that, and then in both cases they count the number of jaywalkers. They compare these numbers with each other. So how many people jaywalk in the high social capital neighborhood and how many people jaywalk in the low social capital neighborhood. And then in both scenarios, in both settings, they put a rubbish sack nearby the traffic light, and then again they counted the number of jaywalkers at a given time. and looks at the difference between high social capital and low social capital. And then we can compare these two differences. That's sort of, again, like this design, this difference in difference approach, where you kind of look at the difference between high and low social capital neighborhoods before placing the rubbish sack. Then you have the treatment, putting the rubbish sacks there, and then you compare the difference between low and high social capital neighborhood again after the treatment, and then you look at the difference between these two differences. And now we have a similar graph. So what do we see here? Well, first of all, again, we have like low social capital on the left-hand side and high social capital neighborhoods on the right-hand side. And what sticks out is that in both cases, the gray bars are taller, are higher than the white bars. So that kind of actually says quite a lot. So when you place a rubbish sack next to a traffic light, lots of more people jaywalk. It's pretty stunning, actually. You know, like I don't know, in the low social capital context, like 18.5% people jaywalk. But when you place a rubbish sack next to exactly that traffic light, it's more than 31% of the people that jaywalk. And when you look at the high social capital neighborhoods, there it's pretty stunning. So there we have in the control setting, so just generally normal, around 70% of the people jaywalk. But when you put a rubbish sack next to that traffic light, this number goes up to over 60%. Right? So putting a rubbish sack next to a traffic light makes people jaywalk, or makes people much more likely to jaywalk. The idea really is, I don't know, now we're coming back to the rational choice idea, you know, like this is a cue that you observe about how likely you think something gets sanctioned. And when you observe a rubbish sack where it should not be, you think, okay, somebody violated that norm already to litter, I don't know, in public, and you observe that, then you think, okay, probably I won't get sanctioned for breaking another norm as well. And that's what you observe here, that the gray bars are higher than the white bars. But also, very interestingly, this difference between treatment and control is obviously much more pronounced in the high social capital context. So there, placing the rubbish sack really matters. But think it through. Think about a really fancy, posh neighborhood in Munich somewhere. You know, it's really clean. It's a bit like Dublin 4. You have embassies everywhere. You know, people spend millions on their houses there, and there you have like this obvious breaking of the norm. There, it really sticks out when you put a rubbish sack just in public, because normally you don't see it there. You also don't expect to see it there, right? So there, this norm, breaking this norm is much more salient, and it has a much more pronounced effect. While when I see rubbish lying around in the neighborhood where I live, you know, it's a dodgy area of town, nobody thinks about it. Now, well, it still has an effect, obviously, that we see, and more people would litter than two. But, you know, we are used to it in many ways. It's not something unusual. It's not something that really sticks out as it would stick out in Dublin 4 or in the posh neighborhood in Munich. So that's what we see. So that it seems to be that social capital really matters for how disorder spreads. Social context matters for how people react to minor norm violations. Social clues as signals for social control. Signs of disorder are more salient in neighborhoods with high social capital, and the contagion of norm violation is more pronounced in neighborhoods with high social capital. So that's basically a summary of the findings of the paper by Koichnik and Bulbrink, but the paper is also on Brightspace. You can read more on it if you want. So now I want to continue because I read this paper and I was teaching that paper for the first time last year, but then I thought, oh, hang on a moment, there's something there's something a little fishy about that paper. And that's how you need to approach it when you read a paper. You need to think about, first of all, trying to understand it, but then discuss it and then kind of think about, okay, criticize it. Like what are problems with that paper? And one major problem that I saw in that paper was this idea that you could basically use information about a neighborhood to make an inference on individuals. And hang on a moment, didn't we talk about that in the lecture already before? Yes, we did. It's called the ecological fallacy. Ecological fallacy is when you draw from results on a population on an individual. For example, I don't know, let's say on average, people with higher IQ wear glasses. And then you meet somebody who wears glasses, and then you think that person is intelligent. That's an ecological fallacy. And that's sort of where the levels have been mixed up. We talked about this a lot. We had a whole lecture on this. And in many ways, this is exactly the mistake that Koischnik and Wolbring make in this paper. So when I read it, I thought immediately, hang on a moment, how can you do that? Because there are the people that jaywalk, for example, or the people that litter, that kind of go to the bike and throw the flyer down. How can you know that these are the people that actually are of high social class or that are of low social class? How can you know? This is if you have lots of people in the neighborhoods, yeah, maybe they have a higher chance, but you don't know for sure that that individual actually has a higher social class as well, that jaywalked or that took the bike and threw the flyer onto the floor. So that's an ecological fallacy. So I thought, hang on a moment, let's study this in a different way. It's a great idea to bring other factors in that might matter for the spread of disorder, and that's a contribution that Koischnik and Wolbring really did. But I thought, shouldn't we bring in more individual data about the people that actually litter, instead of talking very generally about the neighborhood that they live in, the neighborhood that they walk and so on. Shouldn't it really be about the individual people as well? Of course, it could even be both together, It could be like an individual factor. Let's say, I don't know, I have a certain social class background. I behave differently in a posh neighborhood than in a dodgy neighborhood. And that might be different for somebody else who has a different educational background than me. Right? So that could still matter. So so it's not to say that the social context does not matter at all. But for me, the most relevant thing that I would be really keen on are the individual attributes of the individuals that participate in these studies. So that's the starting point, and I had an idea how to do that, but also I was just really keen to replicate some of these studies. It's like a cool research design, and I wanted to get more into experimental designs anyway and conduct some of these studies myself. So I sat down with students and thought about how we could actually do it. And the idea that I had, and then we implemented it with two master's students from last year. It turned out to be their master's project, and we're writing out the paper at the moment. Really came back to this idea of littering. And that's a very, very straightforward one. We thought, hang on, we can replicate that. We can print out some crappy flyers and attach them to bikes at UCT. And that's what we've done. So we created this flyer. It's exactly the flyer. It said, we wish you a happy holidays. And there was this picture of the two playing football. And below it said, Sports and Beyond, Main Road 14, Sandy Ford. And that's a fictional address. And in a second, I get back to that address, what we've done with that. Because this is how we got to individual information. So we attached those flyers to the bikes, and while we attached those flyers to the bikes, we essentially rated the quality of the bike. Yeah? So we rated this on a scale from 1 to 10, where 10 was a high quality bike, a fancy, very expensive bike, while 1 was a really shitty bike that fell apart. Yeah, and our idea here was that this might give us a proxy for the background of the individuals that participate in our study. So we attached this flyer, and each flyer had a different, and this is sort of where the innovation comes into play. Every flyer had a different house number. So some flyers had Main Road 1, Main Road 2, Main Road 3, and so on of that flyer. And then we could use that information to link it with the rating that we gave each bike. And so afterwards, we literally checked the flyers that were lying onto the floor, and then we could tell from which bike those flyers were thrown onto the floor. Yeah? Does it make sense? So I realize it's really difficult to explain these things without seeing you or without getting some sort of feedback. It's really odd. But anyway, so let's say we went there and we got the first bike and we thought, okay, this is an expensive bike. We gave it a 10. So we attached that flyer to that bike, and it said Sports and Beyond, Main Road 1, Sandy Ford. And elsewhere we noted, okay, the flyer with the Main Road number 1 flyer or that bike got a 10 on the quality score. And then we went to the next flyer, and that said Main Road 2. And we attached that to the next bike. And then again, we rated that bike, and elsewhere recorded the quality of the bike that matches the flyer with that says Main Road 2. So that's sort of how we went. And then afterwards, we could look at the flyers that are actually on the floor to get an idea for who threw the flyer onto the floor. Was it the people with the fancy bikes or the people with the shitty bikes? Okay, so we couldn't use graffiti to break a context norm. I would have loved to do that, but seriously, getting ethical clearance for this one was already tough enough. Yeah? It was just really weird, but I think that's a consequence of many of my colleagues not doing empirical studies like this. So I think it's a very straightforward one, and a very harmless experiment. There could be very different experiments that you could conduct. It's really just about the flyer that is on the floor, and afterwards we clean it all up. But we couldn't put graffiti onto the walls, so we needed to find another way to break the context norm. Although that just didn't work. So what we did, we wanted to recreate somehow an order condition and a disorder condition. And you see now, first of all, the bikes on UCD campus. This is literally in front of the library. You know all this place. Probably you park your own bikes there. Maybe you were even part of our study last year. So in the order condition, you see we attached the flyers to the bikes, but we made sure there was no rubbish lying around on the floor. Now that's the left picture. On the right picture, this is like a day later or 2 days later, we attached those flyers again to the bikes, but this time we deliberately put flyers onto the floor. How you see how flyers are already lying around everywhere? This is how we created the disorder condition. And now our hypothesis, first of all, was that in the disorder condition, more people would throw their flyer also onto the ground, onto the floor, than in the order condition, where there is no rubbish, no flyers lying around. Now that's a simple replication, or as close as it gets to the Kaiser et al. Paper, but also to what Koischnik and Wolbrich did. We also conducted the same thing in a car park. Hang on, let me turn. Yeah. We also conducted the same thing in a car park, where we put flyers behind the windshield wipers of cars, and looked at how many people throw their flyer onto the floor. And the treatment again was like other flyers are on the floor. But I don't know, let's not get confused too much by that. So what are the results? So let's just focus on the bike parts here right now. That's what you see on the left-hand side. And there you see that in 90% of the cases, people littered, threw that flyer onto the floor in the order condition. The order condition is where everything was clean. That's sort of like the picture here on the left. But in the disorder condition, where we already put lots of flyers onto the floor, so suggesting that it seems to be fine to throw the flyers onto the floor, over 70% of the people littered and threw that flyer onto the floor and did not take it to a rubbish bin nearby. So that's pretty stunning. I thought it was pretty cool. We could really replicate the spread of disorder and how giving that cue of breaking a norm, how that kind of has people then break other norms or break the same norm as well. So when you make an environment look dirty, other people will make it even more dirty. That's the bottom line here, which is very interesting, which is pretty cool, because that means, okay, we should keep things clean. That's a real argument for why we should really keep things clean, because if we kind of let that norm be established, that it's fine, that nobody seems to care with having stuff on the floor, that kind of encourages other people to break it as well, and then also to litter. So that's the main finding, the replication, where we replicated that. In our example with the cars, we did exactly the same thing, and we also found that in the disorder condition, more people broke the norm of not littering. More people threw a flyer onto the floor. There's some more results on that. This is now a logistic regression result where the dependent variable is did people litter, yes or no. And positive numbers that are significant tell you that increase in your independent variable, make it more likely that the dependent variable is 1 compared to 0. So in this case, you see positive, when you look at the bikes areas on the left, and you look at the line with disorder conditions, you see positive numbers, and those positive numbers basically tell us that folks in a disorder condition were more likely to litter. Now that's sort of what you see here. You see different models, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the first model is the very simplest one. This is really just comparing how many people littered it in the disorder condition compared to how many people littered in the order condition. But now we've also done some other things. Now we brought in these measures that we had for the quality of the bikes. Or we also had the same thing for the quality of the cars, right? And then we also brought in an interaction effect between the quality of the bikes or the quality of the cars and the disorder condition. And what you see here is now you see some effects popping up, like a negative effect for the interaction between disorder condition and quality. It's minus 0.897. That's like in Model 3 on bikes. And that basically says, holding everything else constant, people who have high quality bikes seem to litter less in a disorder condition than in an order condition. These things can become a little difficult to interpret. So one way to go about it is to think about predicted probabilities. So what you see here now is, again, like bikes and cars. At the x-axis, you have the quality of the bikes. It's like 1 being a shitty bike, 10 being a really expensive bike. And on the y-axis, you see the probability for people littering. And now you see 2 lines, a solid line and a dashed line. The solid line is our disorder condition. So that basically tells us how many people threw the flyer, or what is the expected probability for people to throw a flyer onto the floor when there was already rubbish lying around. Now that's what this line tells us. And now you see that line is actually different depending on the quality of the bike. So when people have a low quality bike, they are more likely to litter in the disorder condition. While when they have a high quality bike, they are less likely to litter in a disorder condition. That's the solid line in the bikes graph. When you look now at the dashed line in the bikes graph, you see that people with a low quality bike are less likely to litter in the order condition. And as people have more fancy bikes, even in the order condition, there's a higher predicted probability now for them to litter. So what this basically says is that for folks with high quality bikes, there isn't really a difference between order and disorder condition anymore. It kind of becomes closer together, right? While for people who have low quality bikes, the difference between order and disorder condition is very pronounced. We've done something similar with the cars. I don't want to go into details about that. Also, this is a lot of work in progress. The whole thing is work in progress. But to sum it up, it really is like taking this idea of, can we replicate the spreading of disorder? And we've done that on campus. We replicated the study of Kaiser et al. But then we kind of building on the second paper that I presented, like Koichnik and Wolbring, who brought in social context into it, we kind of thought about, hang on, can we go a little deeper into that and look at individual attributes in that regard? How do individual attributes, how do they moderate the effect of disorder and order condition on the probability to litter? And first of all, we find that these individual level attributes, they matter. They matter, right? So it's not just, that people will behave like this in an order condition and people will behave like that in a disorder condition. It really depends on the people that are there. It really depends on the participants. Like, who are your participants? So that's sort of a lot of work in progress. As I said, we're still working on that. We're just basically writing a paper on that. But I thought it's pretty cool to include, and you might like to see about how we actually took this idea of broken windows based on the study by Kaiser et al. And then Koichnik and Wolbring, and try to replicate that on the campus at UCD. We've done that last year. Students wrote a master thesis on it. And we also added this twist of bringing in the individual attributes. So the individual attributes matter. It's not just the neighborhood. It's not just the social capital that matters. It's really also about individual attributes that matter. It's not just something abstract about the neighborhood, although this might still matter, but individual attributes really matter. So in essence, we brought individuals back in to this research on broken window theory. Okay, so this was our first lecture like this. It's actually pretty exhausting to do it. It's kind of odd to give a lecture without seeing you guys and without having any feedback. So this is tough. What I might do over the next lectures, I might post some videos. I might do a little bit of editing on that, of lectures on topics that I've given before already. It's not exactly the same lectures. You know, I just already have those recordings. So there's nothing wrong with that, and I might find it actually easier than recording all the lectures here by myself. But this is like a new lecture that I wanted to add, because I also wanted to bring in this new research that I have been conducting with students myself. Okay, so for the next lecture, we talk about norms. The reading is by Villa, Kobubara, and Macy on the forced enforcement of unpopular norms. I will post it on Brightspace, and I should also now complete the syllabus on Brightspace, so we get back into a rhythm where you see lectures popping up, 2 lectures per week being posted on Brightspace in a normal way, and you also see the readings to it and the assigned or the core readings that you guys need to do, which is still relevant for the take-home test and then also for the assignments later on. Okay, guys, take care. Have a good rest of the week. Bye-bye.